A routine walk home turned into a nightmare when a racist cop attacked two innocent black boys, completely unaware that their father was one of the most powerful men in law enforcement. But now that the truth is out, what will happen next? How will this FBI chief respond to the injustice against his own children? Will he seek revenge, or will he use his power to change the system? Stay tuned to find out. And don't forget to subscribe and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. The afternoon sun cast a golden hue over Harrington Heights, a quiet suburban neighborhood where Malcolm Reeves had built a life for his twin sons, Elijah and Isaiah. To most, the community represented the American dream: neatly trimmed lawns, friendly neighbors, and good schools. But Malcolm, a deputy director at the FBI, knew that beneath its picturesque surface, the reality for a black family could be different. At 13 years old, Elijah and Isaiah were inseparable. Though identical in appearance, their personalities balanced each other perfectly. Elijah, the introspective thinker, often lost in books and ideas, while Isaiah was the energetic one, always cracking jokes and leading the charge. They were just kids, eager to enjoy life, without the weight of the world's prejudices. That Friday afternoon, Malcolm stood in the driveway, waiting for his sons to return from school. As he scrolled through his phone, his thoughts drifted to an upcoming FBI briefing, but the sound of laughter pulled him back. Looking up, he saw Elijah and Isaiah approaching, playfully shoving each other and debating something with intensity. "I'm telling you, Dad, LeBron is still the GOAT," Isaiah announced as they reached him. Elijah scoffed. "No way. Michael Jordan dominated an era. No competition." Malcolm chuckled, unlocking the car. "I see you two are still at it. Hop in. I'll settle this once and for all. Over burgers." The moment was ordinary, warm, and familiar. A father and his sons simply enjoying the small things. None of them knew that within the hour their world would be turned upside down. The afternoon air was crisp as Elijah and Isaiah made their way home from school, their backpacks slung lazily over their shoulders. Their voices carried through the neighborhood as they argued about basketball, their playful banter bouncing off the tree-lined streets of Harrington Heights. "I'm telling you, Isaiah, you can't just ignore the stats," Elijah said, rolling his eyes. "Jordan has 6 championships. 6! You can't just—" Isaiah groaned, throwing his hands in the air. "Man, stats don't tell the whole story. LeBron is playing against tougher competition, and he's still breaking records." Their laughter was genuine, the kind that comes naturally between brothers who know each other inside and out. But their joy was cut short the moment a police cruiser slowed to a stop beside them. The driver's side window rolled down, revealing Officer Bradley Cooper, a burly white cop with a hardened face. His cold, scrutinizing eyes locked onto the boys as if they had committed some crime just by existing in that space. "Hey!" His voice was sharp, filled with authority. "What are you two doing?" The twins froze, exchanging confused glances before Elijah cautiously answered, Walking home, sir." Cooper's eyes narrowed. "Don't get smart with me. You were shouting in the street, acting like you own the place. This is a school zone, not a playground." Isaiah, always the bolder of the two, furrowed his brows. "We weren't doing anything wrong. We were just talking." "Talking?" Cooper snapped, his voice dripping with disdain. "You little punks think you can disturb the peace and get away with it?" Before either boy could respond, Cooper swung open the car door and stepped out. He loomed over them, his presence suffocating. In one swift motion, he grabbed Isaiah by the arm, yanking him forward with unnecessary force. "Hey, what are you doing?" Elijah shouted, stepping forward instinctively. Back up, Cooper barked, shoving Elijah so hard that he stumbled onto the pavement. The impact sent a sharp jolt of pain through Elijah's hands and knees. His breath caught in his throat as he looked up in shock. A few onlookers had stopped on the sidewalk, whispering amongst themselves, but no one stepped in. Isaiah struggled in Cooper's grip. "Let me go," he cried, fear creeping into his voice. Cooper smirked. "Maybe you two need a lesson in respect." Suddenly, a deep voice cut through the chaos. "Let my son go. Right now." Everyone turned. Malcolm Reeves stood just a few feet away, his stance firm, his expression unreadable, but his voice carried a weight that demanded immediate attention. For the first time, Cooper hesitated, his grip on Isaiah faltering. He had no idea who he had just messed with, but he was about to find out. Malcolm's presence was commanding, his voice unwavering. Though his fists clenched at his sides, his tone remained dangerously calm. "I said, let my son go." Officer Cooper turned his head, sizing up the man who had just confronted him. He saw a tall, well-built black man in a crisp button-down shirt, his face a mask of quiet fury. But what Cooper didn't recognize, not yet at least, was that this wasn't just any father. Cooper scoffed, tightening his grip on Isaiah's arm. "You better back off, sir, before I have to detain all three of you for obstruction." Isaiah let out a small, pained gasp, and that was all it took for Malcolm to step forward, his patience snapping. "That's enough." His voice carried authority, the kind that silenced a room. "You are crossing a serious line." Cooper sneered. "Oh, yeah? And who exactly are you?" Malcolm took another step forward, closing the space between them. "I'm the man who's going to hold you accountable. And unless you want to see your badge revoked by the end of the day, you will release my son. Now." For the first time, uncertainty flickered in Cooper's eyes. There was something about the way this man spoke, his confidence, his absolute certainty, that made Cooper hesitate. A few people on the sidewalk had pulled out their phones, recording the interaction. The tension in the air was thick. Cooper looked around, realizing that he had lost control of the situation. With a grunt, he finally let go of Isaiah, shoving the boy roughly toward his father. Isaiah stumbled, but caught himself, immediately rushing into Malcolm's protective presence. Malcolm placed a steady hand on his son's shoulder before fixing his piercing gaze on Cooper. "You just put your hands on an innocent child," Malcolm said, his voice low but filled with cold fury. "And if you think for one second that I'm letting this go, you're mistaken." Cooper forced a smirk, but the sweat forming at his temple betrayed him. "You people always make everything about race." Malcolm's expression darkened. "No, Officer Cooper. You did that the moment you singled out my sons." The air crackled with tension, but Malcolm already knew. This wasn't over. A tense silence stretched between them. Malcolm's gaze never wavered, his eyes locked onto Cooper's, like a predator assessing its prey. The air was thick with an unspoken challenge, and for the first time that day, Cooper looked uncertain. Then, a sharp voice cut through the tension. "Officer Cooper, what's going on here?" Everyone turned as a second police car pulled up. Sirens off, but lights flashing. Two uniformed officers stepped out, one of them, Sergeant Miller, frowning as he took in the scene. Malcolm straightened, recognizing him. They had crossed paths before. "I'd like to know the same thing, Sergeant," Malcolm said coolly, placing a protective hand on Isaiah's back. "Your officer just physically assaulted my sons." Miller's expression shifted from confusion to concern. He glanced at Cooper, whose confidence faltered for a split second before he scoffed. Just a misunderstanding, Cooper muttered. They were disturbing the peace, and I was handling it. Disturbing the peace. Malcolm's voice was razor sharp. He turned to the bystanders. Did anyone here witness these children disturbing the peace? A murmur spread through the crowd, several people shaking their heads. One woman, still clutching her phone, stepped forward hesitantly. They weren't doing anything wrong, she said. Just talking, laughing. She nodded toward Cooper. He grabbed them for no reason. Sergeant Miller's jaw tightened. He looked at Malcolm, then at the people recording, and finally at Cooper, who had gone rigid. Then, something changed. Miller's eyes widened slightly as realization dawned. He looked at Malcolm again, this time with recognition. Wait a second. His voice lowered, cautious. You're Deputy Director Malcolm Reeves, from the FBI. Cooper stiffened, his face suddenly losing color. Malcolm folded his arms. Yes, and your officer just put his hands on my sons. For the first time, Cooper looked shaken. The arrogance drained from his expression, replaced by something dangerously close to fear. Sergeant Miller inhaled sharply, before turning back to Cooper. His voice was clipped. All professionalism now. Step back, Cooper, right now. Cooper clenched his jaw but obeyed, his entire demeanor shifting from aggression to realization. He had just made the biggest mistake of his career. Malcolm kept his gaze locked on him. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The atmosphere was thick with tension as Officer Cooper stepped back, his face pale, as the weight of his actions began to sink in. Sergeant Miller, now fully aware of the situation, turned to Malcolm with a mixture of caution and regret. Mr. Reeves, Miller began, his voice measured. Malcolm cut him off, with a sharp shake of his head. Deputy Director Reeves, he corrected, his voice cold and unwavering. And your officer just assaulted my sons without cause. Cooper scoffed, trying to regain control of the situation. Look, I was just doing my job. These kids were acting suspicious. Malcolm's eyes darkened. Acting suspicious? His voice was dangerously low, each word carrying measured fury. Tell me, Officer Cooper, what exactly was suspicious about two kids walking home from school? Was it their laughter, their backpacks, or was it simply the color of their skin? Cooper's jaw clenched. His defensiveness was cracking under the weight of Malcolm's authority. Around them, the small crowd that had gathered grew restless. More people were recording, and whispers of racial profiling rippled through the bystanders. Sergeant Miller sighed, clearly realizing the gravity of the situation. We'll be filing a report on this, he said carefully. I assure you, Mr. Deputy Director Reeves, this will be investigated. Malcolm let out a humorless chuckle, shaking his head. Investigated? His voice dripped with disbelief. We both know how these investigations go, Sergeant. A few meetings behind closed doors, a slap on the wrist, and business as usual. Miller hesitated, and Malcolm stepped closer, his presence suffocating. I want his badge on my desk by the morning, Malcolm stated plainly. And, if I don't see it, I'll be taking this beyond your department. Trust me when I say, I have friends in high places. The threat hung in the air, undeniable. Cooper lost it. You can't do this. I was doing my damn job. His voice rose, his face red with anger. This is why we have problems in this country. You people always pull the race card. The moment the words left his mouth, Malcolm knew Cooper had sealed his own fate. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Sergeant Miller's face turned to pure stone, his jaw locked with tension. Malcolm, however, remained unmoved. He simply stared at Cooper, the weight of his silence heavier than any words. Miller cleared his throat, forcing composure into his voice. Officer Cooper, hand over your badge and gun. Now. What? Cooper's face twisted in pure disbelief. You just dug your own grave, Miller muttered under his breath. With no choice left, Cooper yanked his badge off his chest and threw it onto the ground before storming off. The crowd watched in stunned silence. Malcolm took a steady breath, his grip firm on his son's shoulders. This isn't over, he murmured. Not even close. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with anticipation. Reporters lined the back wall, their cameras ready to capture what had become a landmark case of police misconduct. The trial of Officer Bradley Cooper wasn't just about one man's abuse of power. It was about a broken system finally being held accountable. Malcolm sat at the plaintiff's table, his presence commanding yet composed. His sons, Elijah and Isaiah, were not in the room. He refused to subject them to the chaos of the trial, but they were on his mind with every word spoken. Across the courtroom, Cooper sat stiffly, dressed in a navy suit instead of a police uniform. But no suit could hide his guilt. His face was pale, his usual arrogance replaced by a nervous edge. He had once felt untouchable, but today he was a defendant on trial for assault, abuse of power, and violating civil rights. The prosecution wasted no time. They presented video evidence from security cameras and bystander footage. The grainy clips played on the screen for the jury to see. Cooper grabbing Isaiah's arm, shoving Elijah to the ground, smirking as he spewed condescending remarks. Murmurs spread through the room. Even the judge's jaw tightened at the sight of Cooper's actions. The prosecution then called witnesses, bystanders who had recorded the incident, the woman who had spoken up that day, and finally Malcolm himself. When Malcolm took the stand, the courtroom fell silent. Mr. Reeves, the prosecutor began, her voice firm. Can you describe what you witnessed that day? Malcolm leaned forward, his voice steady, yet charged with controlled anger. I saw a grown man, a police officer, to use unnecessary force against two children, Malcolm said. I saw my sons, 13-year-old boys, treated like criminals for simply walking home. And worst of all, I saw a man so convinced of his own power that he thought he could get away with it. The jury hung on to every word. The defense attorney, desperate, tried to paint Cooper as a dedicated officer who had simply misread the situation. Mr. Reeves, the defense attorney began, isn't it possible that Officer Cooper was simply enforcing public safety? Malcolm arched a brow, his expression unreadable. If that's true, he said, voice sharp, then tell me why no other children were stopped that day. Why only my sons? Silence. The defense attorney shifted uncomfortably, scrambling for words. But it was clear. There was no justification. After 3 days of deliberation, the jury reached a verdict. We, the jury, find the defendant, Bradley Cooper, guilty on all counts. A collective exhale rippled through the room. Cooper's face drained of color. The judge's voice was firm. Officer Cooper, you are hereby stripped of your badge. You will serve 5 years in prison, and your case will serve as an example of why law enforcement officers must be held to the highest standard. Malcolm closed his eyes for a brief moment, then turned toward the door. This wasn't just justice. This was a reckoning. As Malcolm stepped out of the courthouse, the cold air hit his face, but he barely felt it. The crowd outside erupted into a mix of cheers and murmurs as reporters swarmed forward, shoving microphones in his direction. The news of Bradley Cooper's conviction had spread like wildfire, a rare moment of true accountability in a system that so often failed to deliver justice. Malcolm raised a hand, silencing the noise. His voice, though calm, carried the weight of the moment. This verdict is a step in the right direction, he said. But let's be clear. Justice isn't just about punishing one man. It's about fixing a broken system. My sons will never forget what happened to them, and neither will I. We can celebrate today, but tomorrow, the real fight continues. The cameras flashed, capturing the determined fire in his eyes. As Malcolm made his way through the crowd, his phone buzzed. A text from home. Elijah. Did we win, Dad? Malcolm paused, his chest tightening. He knew what his son was really asking. Is it over? Are we safe now? His fingers hovered over the keyboard before he finally typed. We won today, son. But the fight's not over. Later, that night, back home, Elijah and Isaiah were waiting for him. The second Malcolm walked through the door, Isaiah rushed up to him. You did it, Dad, he said, eyes wide with excitement. Cooper's finished. He can't do this to anyone else. Malcolm set down his coat, his expression softer now. Yes, he admitted. He won't hurt anyone else. But there are more like him. And we have to make sure no one else gets protected by the system the way he was. Elijah, quieter than usual, finally spoke. But will anything really change? His voice was hesitant, unsure. There are so many like him, and people will just forget after a while. Malcolm knelt in front of his son, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. They won't forget, he said firmly, because we won't let them. Isaiah nodded, his usual energy replaced with something more powerful. Resolve. The battle had been won, but as Malcolm looked at his sons, stronger, wiser, ready to fight for something bigger than themselves, he knew the war had only just begun. The story of Malcolm Reeves and his sons is not just a powerful narrative. It's a reflection of real-life injustices that many people face. It serves as a wake-up call about the dangers of racial profiling, abuse of power, and the importance of holding authorities accountable. One key takeaway is that staying silent is not an option. If Malcolm had walked away that day, if bystanders had chosen not to record, Officer Cooper might have never faced justice. This reminds us that speaking up matters, whether it's reporting injustice, supporting victims, or advocating for policy changes. Another lesson is that power is not just in the hands of those who enforce the law, but also in those who demand justice. Malcolm used his knowledge, resources, and resilience to expose the truth. It shows that knowing your rights and understanding the system can be a powerful weapon against oppression. Finally, this story teaches us that real change takes persistence. One victory doesn't mean the fight is over. We must continue to challenge discrimination, educate future generations, and push for systemic reform. The fight for justice is ongoing. The question is, will we be brave enough to stand for it? Imagine you're in his shoes. Your loved ones are targeted unfairly, and you have to make a decision. Would you, 1. Fight back, demand justice, and risk facing a long battle against the system? 2. Stay silent, avoid conflict, and try to protect yourself and your family from further trouble. There's no easy answer, and that's why I want to hear from you. Comment 1 or 2 below, and tell me why you'd make that choice. Let's start a real conversation about what justice means in today's world. And if this story moved you, hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss more eye-opening stories like this. Your voice matters. Let's make it heard. On fire.